Two British scientists are finally revealing the DNA evidence they say helped solve one of history's biggest crime mysteries, the identity of Jack the Ripper.
What if one of the world's greatest criminal mysteries has finally been solved after more than a century? For 137 years, the identity of Jack the Ripper has remained hidden in the shadows of history. In 1888, a series of brutal murders terrified the streets of Whitechapel, turning London into a city gripped by fear. The killer vanished without a trace, leaving behind clues, letters, and endless theories, but never a name that could be proven. Generations of detectives, historians, and researchers tried to solve the case. Hundreds of suspects were investigated. Books were written. Documentaries explored every possible theory. Yet the truth always slipped away, like smoke, in the foggy streets of Victorian London. But now, modern science may have finally cracked the mystery. Using advanced DNA testing, researchers recently examined historical evidence connected to the murders. What they discovered has shocked historians and crime experts around the world. According to the new genetic analysis, the identity of Jack the Ripper may no longer be a mystery at all. After 137 years of speculation, the evidence points to a name that has been debated for decades, and if the findings are correct, one of history's most infamous killers may finally have been unmasked. If you enjoy uncovering real historical mysteries, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more incredible discoveries. The legend and the shawl. For many years, the story of Jack the Ripper felt more like a dark legend than a real case. In Whitechapel, fear spread through the narrow streets of London in 1888, while the killer disappeared without leaving clear proof behind. Because no one could catch him, people began building wild theories. Some believed he was a skilled surgeon, hiding a terrible secret. Others claimed he was a troubled artist, or even someone connected to the royal family. One famous rumor even suggested that the murders were part of a secret plot involving Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria. But in the end, the clue that changed everything was far simpler. It was a shawl, an old piece of fabric believed to have been found near the body of Catherine Eddowes in 1888. For decades, people ignored it, thinking it was just another strange souvenir from the case. Yet that forgotten shawl would later become one of the most talked about pieces of evidence in the entire mystery. The science behind the discovery. So, here's the deal. In 2007, an author and amateur sleuth named Russell Edwards bought it at an auction. He was convinced it was the real deal. He staked his money and his reputation on one final, desperate gamble: to use technology the Victorian police could not even dream of. Edwards tracked down Dr. Jari Luhalainen, a world-renowned expert in genetic analysis from old, degraded samples at Liverpool John Moores University. This wasn't like a fresh TV crime show. This was a piece of silk that was over 125 years old at the time of the test. It was contaminated by countless hands, by time, and by the elements. Getting anything from it was considered a miracle. Dr. Luhalainen and his team got to work in a sterile lab. They focused on the stains. Using advanced techniques, they carefully extracted the microscopic genetic material left behind. They were looking for something called mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. The mitochondrial DNA doesn't undergo the same recombination as occurs to the other 23 chromosomes. So your mitochondrial DNA was inherited intact from your mother, who got it from her mother, and so on. What most people don't realize is that mtDNA is a genetic time traveler. Unlike regular DNA, which is a mix from both parents, you only get mtDNA from your mother. She got it from her mother and so on, passed down in an unbroken female line for thousands of years. It's tough, it lasts a long time, and it's the perfect tool for cracking a historical case. Confirming the evidence. The next step for researchers was to answer a basic question. Was the shawl actually connected to the crime? To find out, investigators located a living relative from the family of Catherine Eddowes, one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. Scientists took a DNA sample from that relative and compared it with the genetic material found in the bloodstains on the shawl. The result was astonishing. The DNA matched perfectly, confirming that the fabric had indeed been present during the murder in Whitechapel in 1888. The old piece of cloth was no longer just a strange historical item. It had become real evidence. But the discovery didn't stop there. Alongside the victim's DNA, scientists found other genetic traces believed to belong to the killer. This opened the door to identifying the man responsible. Researchers then compared the DNA with samples from a living descendant connected to a long-suspected figure in the case. When the results came back, the match pointed directly to Aaron Kosminski. For many investigators, this moment felt like closing a chapter that had remained open for more than a century, finally giving a possible name to one of history's most mysterious criminals, the asylum secret. But Kosminski wasn't some new discovery. He was the man police suspected all along. The name Aaron Kosminski means nothing to most people. It's not a name that sells books or inspires blockbuster movies. And that's exactly the point. The wow factor here isn't that the Ripper was a glamorous celebrity. The wow factor is that he was a 23-year-old Polish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in the very heart of Whitechapel. He wasn't a phantom, he was a local, and the police knew exactly who he was. Kosminski had fled Poland, then part of the Russian Empire, to escape the brutal pogroms and had arrived in London with his family, settling in the East End. By all accounts, he was a deeply troubled man. He was known to be mentally unwell, suffering from what modern experts believe was paranoid schizophrenia. He was plagued by dark visions, auditory hallucinations, and a profound, violent hatred of women. This isn't just speculation. This is what the police at the time believed. While the public and the newspapers were going insane over the Dear Boss letters and theories about mad doctors, the top cops on the case were quietly building their own shortlist. And Kosminski's name was at the very top. Chief Constable Melville McNagton wrote a famous internal memo in 1894 that named Kosminski as a primary suspect. He described him as a man who had a strong homicidal tendency and was averse to women. But here's the catch. The most chilling evidence, the real bombshell, comes from Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. Swanson was the man who oversaw the entire Ripper investigation. He was on the ground every single day. Years later, after he retired, he got a copy of his boss's memoirs. In the margin of the book, right next to the section about the Ripper case, Swanson scribbled a private note. He wrote that the perpetrator was Kosminski, the man who was sent to an asylum and perished there. This is history-changing. The officer in charge of the case privately confirmed the man's identity. And get this, Kosminski lived right in the middle of the slaying locations. He was known to be violent. And then in 1891, his family finally had him committed to an asylum where he stayed for the rest of his life. And when did the Jack the Ripper slayings stop? Exactly when Aaron Kosminski was taken off the streets. The DNA, the timeline, and the secret police testimony all point to one terrified and violent man. He was the monster. But to understand the monster, you have to understand the nightmare world that made him. How London Built a Monster. To understand the fear surrounding Jack the Ripper, you have to picture what London was really like in 1888. Movies often show elegant streets, horse carriages, and gentlemen in top hats. But that was only one side of the city. In reality, London was sharply divided. Wealthy families lived comfortably in the western districts, while the East End, especially Whitechapel, was struggling under extreme poverty. Whitechapel was one of the most overcrowded places in the world at the time. Nearly 1 million people were squeezed into a small area filled with narrow streets, dark alleys, and crumbling buildings. Many people had no steady work. Homeless wanderers, immigrants, and laborers lived side by side in conditions that were harsh and unforgiving. Most of the poorest residents stayed in lodging houses, cheap shelters where people paid a few pennies just to have somewhere to rest. These places were dirty, packed with strangers, and often unsafe. Some offered what was called a 4-penny coffin, a narrow wooden box where a person could lie down for the night. Others stretched a rope across a room, so exhausted men could lean against it and sleep while standing. For many women in the area, daily life was a constant fight for survival. The victims later linked to the Ripper, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were not famous or wealthy. They were ordinary women struggling to survive one more night. Often they walked the streets late in the evening trying to earn enough money for a bed in a lodging house. Without that money, they risked sleeping outside in cold, dangerous alleys. This desperate situation made them easy targets. At the same time, the conditions of Whitechapel made it incredibly difficult for police to catch anyone. Modern tools like forensic science, fingerprint databases, or radio communication did not exist. Officers patrolled the streets mostly on foot, carrying little more than a whistle and a wooden baton. Add to that the thick industrial fog that often covered the city, created by coal smoke and damp air, and the streets became a confusing maze. Visibility could drop so low that a person might barely see a few feet ahead. In such chaos, a killer didn't need to be a criminal mastermind. Someone who simply knew the local streets and hidden passageways could disappear within seconds. Crowds, darkness, and fog worked like a shield. In many ways, the environment itself helped create the legend. The crowded streets hid the killer. The poverty made victims vulnerable, and the lack of technology left investigators struggling to keep up, allowing the mystery of Jack the Ripper to grow into one of the most chilling stories in history. When a criminal became a legend. With the city screaming for answers, the London Metropolitan Police launched one of the biggest manhunts in history. They flooded Whitechapel with officers. They interviewed over 2,000 people. They detained and questioned at least 80 men. They followed every single lead. So why did they fail? Yeah, about that. They weren't just fighting a man. They were fighting the time they lived in. And they were fighting a media circus that they helped create first. There was no such thing as forensic science. The concept of a crime scene was brand new. When a victim was found, crowds would rush in. Reporters would trample over evidence. The scene would be contaminated in minutes. Police had no fingerprinting. They had no blood typing. All they had were witness reports from people in dark, foggy streets. Some said he looked shabby. Others said he looked respectable. It was useless. What's truly wild is that they did find clues, but didn't know what to do with them. Near the scene of Catherine Eddowes, the same victim from the shawl, they found a piece of her bloody apron. On the wall above it, someone had written in chalk, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was it a clue from the perpetrator, Was Kosminski, who was Jewish, trying to frame his own people? Or was it just anti-Semitic graffiti? We will never know. The police commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, worried it would start anti-Semitic riots, so he ordered it erased immediately. They washed away one of the only pieces of physical evidence they ever found. Consequently, that's why police were made to erase the graffiti, to take away any suspicion from the Masons. Then came the letters. The predator became a global celebrity when the infamous Dear Boss letter arrived at a London news agency. It taunted the police and promised more to come. And it was signed with the chilling name that would echo in history, Jack the Ripper. The problem? Everyone's obsessed with this, but almost all experts now agree it was a fake, probably written by a journalist at the Star newspaper to sell more papers. But it worked. It created a media frenzy and sent the police on a wild goose chase, sorting through thousands of copycat letters. But here's the catch. One letter was real. The From Hell letter, sent to the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, arrived with a small box. Inside was half of a preserved human kidney. The letter claimed it was from one of the victims. And get this, Catherine Eddowes had her kidney removed by the predator. While the public was obsessed with fake letters and wild theories about doctors and royals, the real predator was walking among them. The case went cold. But now, 137 years later, the science has been challenged. The legend that won't perish. So does this finally solve the mystery of Jack the Ripper? The DNA evidence taken from the famous shawl strongly points toward Aaron Kosminski, a man who had already appeared in old police records as one of the main suspects. Interestingly, historical reports say that Kosminski was later placed in a mental institution around the same time the murders suddenly stopped. For some researchers, the pieces seem to fit together almost perfectly. But the story doesn't end there. When the DNA research was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019, many experts quickly raised serious questions. Their main concern was contamination. After all, the shawl is more than a century old. Over the years, it has been touched by police officers, family members, collectors, and investigators. So critics ask an important question. How can we be completely sure the DNA came from the killer himself? In the end, the mystery may not be fully settled. The evidence points in one direction, but the legend of Jack the Ripper still leaves room for debate. What do you think?